A recent report from the Heritage Foundation is raising questions nationwide about faith, freedom, and a proposed universal day of worship. What does this mean, and why does it matter now? Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guest panelists for today. First, we have with us Mr. Rashawn Baker, who's the president and CEO of the Baker Strategy Group and a former member of the Maryland House of Delegates and former county executive. We also have Mr. Tim Schultz, who's the president of the First Amendment Partnership. We have Mr. Andre Wong, who is the general counsel of the North Pacific Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and Dr. Timothy Golden, who's a professor of philosophy at Whitman College. Gentlemen, great having you here and looking forward to our show. A uniform day of rest. Wow. Earlier this year, the Heritage Foundation issued a report titled Saving America by Saving the Family. Framed as a culture-wide Manhattan project, the report seeks to avert a demographic collapse before the 250th anniversary of American independence. Among its most controversial proposals is a call for the restoration of blue laws by establishing a uniform day of rest on Sundays. The authors argued that a synchronized community pause is necessary to combat spiritual homelessness. The proposal explicitly prioritizes uniformity over flexibility, thus creating a potential legal conflict for Jewish and Seventh-day Adventist communities, among others who observe the Sabbath on Saturday. In their report's own words, the uniform day of rest that limits commercial activities can provide temporal boundaries that help communities to set aside time for religious observance, family gatherings, outdoor activities, and rest. You know, when I take a look at this issue that's going on here, and Tim Schultz, I kind of like the idea of a day where I get together with family and we have fun and we have a day of rest. And it sounds like this is something that is perfect for quote unquote the world. But it seems to be a little bit tricky when you tell me what day I have to hang out with my family, what day this must take place. And it's a uniform thing that should be taking place on a worldwide basis. Is this something where I'm a little bit too concerned? Or should I say, well, maybe I get my Sabbath and I do this on Sunday again. Maybe I should be doubling down. Am I missing something here, or is this a real problem?
Well, Orlin, I just first want to note that this has confirmed my long-held suspicions that you are a fan of the Heritage Foundation. But also, I think that, look, days of rest are great. 2 days are better than one. But I think that this is a classic case where mandating something like this doesn't make a lot of sense. I think there's lots of ways government can encourage it. I think it's great when corporations like Chick-fil-A voluntarily close a day a week because they want to give their employees a day of rest as well. I think it's a great practice, and I think sort of using your consumer dollars to try to, incentivize that kind of corporate behavior is good. I just think when government starts to mandate religious or quasi-religious practices, we're into violations of the, Establishment Clause. And I think, in most cases, the reason that blue laws, Sunday closing laws went away is because they really were in tension with the American tradition of liberty. And over time, I think blue laws, I understand why they existed, but I think they went away for a reason.
Tim Golden, there's smart people who work at the Heritage Foundation. I'm assuming they had to know that there'd be some folk who would have some problems with picking one specific day. Or was this really just to get the dialogue started? Or is this something that maybe they really believe that this is what America, maybe even the world, should be doing?
I guess the best thing about this proposal is that it's a proposal coming from the Heritage Foundation and not coming from the United States Congress, right? This isn't something that's being taken seriously by a legislature. And for that reason, it's something that we shouldn't be too concerned about. But I think I agree with Tim Schultz. The scripture says that in two places in Proverbs, there's a way that seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death, right? There's a lot that seems right about this proposal. The idea of resting, the idea of uniformity, rejuvenation, an emphasis on family life, and all of that. I think all of those things are great, but I think for the most part, people would prefer to dictate those things on their own terms, right? According to their own schedules and how things fit their own lives. And if you're going to propose one day, and that day happens to be a day where, it conflicts with things other people do, then that becomes a problem. So I think, A, this is intended to get the dialogue started, and B, this is also something that the Heritage Foundation sincerely believes. But the best thing about this proposal is that it's not coming from a national legislature or a state legislature, because I think if it was, there would be serious constitutional problems according to the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment.
Andre, but at the end of the day, Sunday's a great day to rest. I'm assuming, I thought maybe the NFL was involved in this in some way and in ensuring that at 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock on the East Coast, people are where they need to be. But it seems like there's a little bit more going on than that here. And the idea of what Tim Golden is saying is this is not a group of people who are just throwing things out there. They really believe that this is what should be happening.
Yeah, and really, if we go the extra step, now we're talking government-imposed uniform day of rest, and that is, as Dr. Golden mentioned, that now poses serious constitutional concerns. The first here is that this proposal has favoritism towards certain religions and traditions over others. The idea of a shared day of rest historically is aligned with Sunday observance. Now, our country is religiously pluralistic. Adventists, Jews, and other Sabbatarians observe Sabbath on Saturday. Muslims gather for communal prayer on Fridays, and many Americans observe no religious day at all. And so this uniform day of rest inevitably privileges some beliefs while burdening others. But even if you look at it secularly, such a law would tend to impose real burdens on religious minorities. We've seen this with the blue laws. If someone is already observing a Sabbath consistent with their faith, requiring them to also shut down their business to refrain from work on a different government-mandated day can create a two-Sabbath problem, if you will, effectively penalizing them economically because of their religious convictions. That's not accommodation, that's coercion.
No, I agree with Andre. I think he hit the key points for me, and that is this is not done, willy-nilly. They knew exactly what they were doing, and the reason it's coming from the Heritage Foundation is to influence state legislatures and the legislature, the Congress, into passing these laws. It's also not accidental that they used the 250th anniversary of the country. The idea is to say to the world and to say to legislators and to federal government that this is a Christian nation. And so we're picking the day that signifies that, and we're picking a time where people need to start thinking about that. That's where the problem arises. It would be interesting to see the debate with the founders over, in fact, establishing, and that's what this would be doing, establishing a religion for the United States, which we have none. And so I think the Heritage Foundation is sending out that trial balloon. They're the canary in the coal mine to see if anybody will bite. And I dare say that you will find legislators who will start putting in bills that look like this. And so I think that's the dangerous part of it, is that this is not just an accident. They've got an administration currently in the Trump administration that agrees with this philosophy, and you could see that rhetoric happening. So I take it very serious when I see anything from the Heritage Foundation. They are very, very smart people, and they know exactly what they're doing, and they know that time is on their side, at least for the next few years. And I think that's why they picked a day in particular and not Wednesday, as the day of rest.
But you know what's interesting, Tim Schultz, is this idea of this quote unquote, this Christian nation. You know, I was recently in Canada where I was looking at the numbers, and Canadians, I believe, are only going to church at around 16% right now. And part of the reason that they claim they do not is because they don't want to look a lot like America, because America is viewed as being this church-going religious, quote unquote, country, that I'm wondering if these are the type of statements not just impacting us domestically, but is this really having some potential impacts on us internationally as we look at these type of topics?
Well, I think that this is one place where Canada could stand to be a little bit more like the United States, Orland. A lot of great things about Canada, but I think America's religiosity is actually a strength of ours relative to Canada and Europe. And I think that as we see the decline in religiosity in the United States, it's actually probably been a net negative for us. And Tocqueville, when he came across the United States, noticed the religiosity, thought it was an absolute strength. And I think that one of the reasons America has a very mixed record in a variety of ways, but I think our religiosity is on balance been a really positive thing.
So the strength of America tied to a Christian nation. Tim Golden, when you hear that, what is the first thing that kind of cuts across your mind? We should be leaning into this. There are ways to figure out how to balance this, or was just really just a bridge too far?
Leaning into this idea of a Christian nation involves a lot of historical assumptions that frankly are unjustified. We have a tendency to read our contemporary moral and religious sensibilities into history so that our engagement with history results in a kind of pseudo Christianity that we sort of impute to the founders that simply did not exist, right? And so I think that we ought to be using the 250th anniversary of the United States as a moment of sober reflection, right? To think seriously about thinkers like Frederick Douglass, who began his political activism with the belief that the U.S. Constitution was a pro-slavery document, but then through his association with white abolitionists who believed otherwise, he came to see that the U.S. Constitution had to be a document that was worthy of our political ambitions. And the only way you're going to do that is to interpret the document as being an anti-slavery document. He exposed the fallacy in the Garrisonian reasoning, which was that the Garrisonians were unwittingly buying into the view of the Dred Scott decision. That if the Constitution was pro-slavery, then slavery could never end and African Americans could never be free. So Douglass changed that view. And I think we ought to be reflecting on the glories of America with views such as that, rather than reading our contemporary sensibilities back into American history to come up with problematic ideas like the one proposed by the Heritage Foundation.
Yeah, I want to give an amen to that.
Yeah, and I'm going to have to let that be the last word. But I think, Tim, you're really putting us where we need to be. How are we making sure that whatever we're putting up is balanced enough so that we're taking into consideration all those that are for and against, but still be allowed to allow that freedom to be exactly what works for all of them in America and across the world, in my opinion, at all times. Coming up, Illinois gutted a law that provided conscience-based protections in healthcare. Stick around for our discussion right after this. When faith and government collide, the issues can be complex and consequential. Faith in Politics explores how religious conviction intersects with law, policy, and public life, offering depth, balance, and clarity with meaningful discussion and trusted insight. To see a bunch of our previous episodes, check us out at faithandpolitics.tv and subscribe to us on YouTube. There's a case that's called the National Institute of Family and Life Advocates versus Treto. For nearly 40 years, Illinois protected healthcare providers who declined to participate in abortion by giving them immunity from lawsuits and disciplinary action. But a few years ago, the state gutted that long-term standing protection. The Illinois legislature amended its Healthcare Right of Conscience Act to require any healthcare professional who refuses to participate in abortion for reasons of conscience to do two things if they want to receive any conscience-based protections: tell the woman about the supposed benefits of abortion and refer them to the list of abortion providers. For pro-life pregnancy centers and many religious healthcare professionals, this mandate attacks the core of their work. These ministries exist to offer life-affirming care rooted in the belief that every person is made in the image of God. The law instead demands that they speak a message that contradicts their faith and the very purpose of their ministries. You know, Andre, when I take a look at these type of cases, on one hand, it looks like they're trying to find some type of balanced approach. But in some instance, a legislature comes in, creates a law, tells someone that, you know what, we know what you believe, but we think what we believe probably even should be more important. And you've had protections in place, but then you pull them for some reason. You know, why are we seeing this back and forth happening? Is this just politics that's going on, or is there really a change in societal points of view, or are the politics trying to change the societal point of views?
Yeah, this case really goes to a basic religious liberty question. When does the government cross the line from regulating professional conduct into compelling ideological speech? And yes, Illinois did have a balanced approach. Under, I believe it's called the Right of Conscience Act, Illinois recognized that healthcare is not just a technical profession, but a deeply moral and, for many, religious line of work. But now, providers who object to abortion must, in order to retain legal protection, speak about abortion in a way that the state prescribes and refer patients to providers who perform it. So from a religious freedom perspective, the state is no longer simply saying you may abstain, but it's saying you may abstain, but only if you actively facilitate what you believe is morally wrong. So this really raises a serious compelled speech First Amendment concerns. The courts have long held that the government cannot force individuals to express messages they disagree with. And this Illinois law arguably does just that.
Yeah, I agree with Andre. I think they've gotten it wrong. This is where the legislature, once again, is overreaching, trying to correct the balance that they see. Now, I certainly, as my personal belief, support a woman's right to choose. But what you see happening is that if something happens in a red state that goes too far to the right, someone in a blue state will try and go too far to the left. And this is the case where you're actually doing what we constitutionally say you can't do, and that is to have people express views that they don't believe. The legislature had it right. There was no reason to change the law. And I guarantee you it was thought of because of something that happened somewhere else. But this is where we have to bring it back to balance and understand what the Constitution says and what individuals and the right of religion is. And I think they got it wrong on this one.
You know, Tim, as the president of First Amendment Partnership, I'm assuming that you're in a lot of areas where you're trying to find balance for legislatures. You know, when you see something like this happen, how do you kind of get involved to try to say, can we get back to some type of medium ground here? Or are there just certain states that's just never going to happen?
We are seeing in some so-called blue states like Illinois, a going back on a long-held balance. I mean, there was a balance struck after Roe v. Wade in the 70s in red and blue states, or what we now call red and blue states, and in the Congress, that essentially abortion is such a deeply personal thing. That was part of the argument for the right to abortion in the first place, that if you oppose it, you shouldn't be made to somehow participate in it, either as a healthcare provider or just as anything, right? And I think that that is being on abortion in particular. That kind of compact has been torn up a little bit in blue states, as there's more and more a sense that if you are against abortion, that doesn't matter, that you are going to have to pay for it as an employer, or that you're going to have to participate in it as a doctor or other healthcare provider. And I think, again, it's happening in bluer states. It's a new I think, emerging trend over the last decade or so in the Democratic Party, at least as it exists out in many state legislatures, not all, but many. And I think we just have to name it. If we were on a different topic, I would criticize and have on this program various things done by the Republican Party that violate conscience and religious liberty. But in this case, I'm just going to have to call balls and strikes. And I think the Illinois Democratic Party is out to lunch on this one.
This case, I tend to agree with Tim on this. This reminds me of the Little Sisters of the Poor case some years ago, where they refused to sign the paperwork for the exemption from the Affordable Care Act because that automatically triggered a referral or enabled their employees to access the abortion medication. So it's a similar dynamic to that. It's not quite the same, but I think that what we're talking about now is what happens when right and wrong give way to right and left, right? I think there's a real problem in America broadly with morality being stuck in the middle of this political battle between ideologies, and both have their problematic ways of construing these constitutional provisions that are so dear to us. But if I could be philosophical here and Aristotelian and quote my last name, the golden mean, right, is the sweet spot is neither to the left nor the right, but somewhere in the middle. And so I think we have to strive to keep morality front and center so that it doesn't get swallowed up by ideology, because the last thing we want is a sort of widespread cynicism that just doesn't see morality at all, but only sees political agendas, right? I think that's a serious problem for us.
Yeah, but Rashawn, we find in politics today that not being the extreme left or the extreme right, you've got no place to be. The idea of being that in the middle is considered to be, lukewarm. Nobody wants to have anything to do with you. So, I mean, and even look at a state where you've got, a Catholic healthcare organization as one of the strongest aspects of what's going on in your state. But yet that state still comes and puts something in place that they know that group is not going to be involved in. So it's like, it's almost like I don't want to be known as being in the middle. I'd rather be on the lunatic left or the lunatic right, because that's where all the action's happening.
Yeah, so you're almost like John Quincy Adams. You're a person without a party. You're not a Jeffersonian or a Jacksonian. But you're absolutely right. What you see is a response to what's going on, not within the state, but what's going on in the nation. So when you see a state like Illinois, which was known as being a pretty balanced, moderate state, start taking positions like this, they're responding to what's going on nationally and what's going on in states that are red. So they're saying, hey, we're going to go all the way over here, rather than looking at what you used to have. And when I was in the legislature, there were two things that were conscience votes: the death penalty, which I'm opposed to, and a right to choose, abortion. Those were where it was not about party, Democrat or Republican or independent. It was your conscience. Nowadays, it's a litmus test. If you're in a blue state, you've got to be for it, whether you are Catholic or it's against your moral beliefs, or if you're in a red state, you've got to be opposed to it. That's why the courts are there. So they hold us check when we go too far in a political leaning. My fear now is that we find court legislatures, whether at the state level or at the federal level, that start to play the politics that we've seen. So there is no, as Tim said, there's no one calling balls and strikes. And I think that's what we have to get back to.
Yeah. Hey, I'll just note, Orland, that the consensus that I referred to earlier that was struck in the U.S. Congress was the so-called church amendments of the 1970s. Those were named after Senator Frank Church, who was the last Democratic senator from the state of Idaho. So, there was a bipartisan consensus in the 70s that is now being torn up. And again, do a different segment about a different topic, I'll criticize the Republicans, but I think in this case, the Illinois Democrats are, the Frank Church had it righter than they did.
But Andre, what I just am confused with Healthcare is such a big issue in every jurisdiction. You know, whether it's the left or the right, how healthy our people are, trying to be involved in preventive care. The idea that politics comes in and shakes that concept around in any way just seems like that's the third rail everyone should stay away from. But it looks like people are running towards that. And I just can't figure it out. I mean, what are you seeing, or does it make sense, even politically?
Yeah, I think it's also important to acknowledge the Illinois state's argument here. Illinois says that it has a strong interest in ensuring that patients receive accurate, timely information and access to legal medical services. That is a legitimate, real interest, especially in healthcare, and where delays or misinformation can have serious consequences. So I acknowledge that. But the burden here is not abstract. For religious ministries like the Catholics, Orthodox, evangelicals, the requirement to speak about the benefits of abortion or provide referrals isn't just uncomfortable. It strikes at the heart of their mission. These organizations are defined by their commitment to life-affirming care. So forcing them to deliver a contrary message risks undermining their credibility and confusing their communities and diluting their religious witness.
I'm gonna have to let that be the last word, but I think where we're really zeroing in is finding a path of least resistance that hopefully is in the best interest of all of us, in particular from a healthcare perspective. And if it's working and it's not broken, maybe we don't need to fix it. Tim Golden, tell me something I don't know.
Greek philosopher Protagoras, a contemporary of Socrates and Plato, taught that you and I could look at the same object. You could say it's black, I could say it's white, and both of us would be correct. I used to think that he was crazy with his example of us looking at the same thing and calling it different, until I considered all of the different interpretations of the Bible and those 9 lawyers in Washington who look at the same document and see it all very differently.
Wow. Andre, tell me something I don't know.
Well, speaking of those 9 lawyers, Justices John Marshall and Salmon P. Chase are the only 2 justices that appear on U.S. currency. Marshall on the $500 bill, Chase on the $10,000 bill, neither of which are still in circulation.
Tim Schultz, tell me something I don't know.
I talked earlier about calling balls and strikes. Major League Baseball has debuted their automated ball strike system so far this year. Fans seem to like it. And so, to quote one of my favorite episodes of The Simpsons, I, for one, welcome our new robot overlords.
Richard, tell me something I don't know.
Well, since we were talking about Illinois, they could actually play a part in history. Their Lieutenant Governor Stratton, could be the next U.S. Senator, which would give us 3 African-American females in the Senate for the first time ever.
Wow. Guys, great having this conversation. Really enjoyed it. And thanks again for you being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.